Hey everyone, Anthony Pierno here, and hope all is well. And coming up on September the 30th, it is International Podcast Day. And here to talk about it is co-founder Dave Lee, who also hosts the Waves of Tech podcast, which has been a four-time finalist in the technology category of the Podcast Awards. Dave, thank you for your time. How are you doing tonight?
Hey, good, Anthony. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So how did International Podcast Day come about? Because you were ahead of the times, I believe, because you came up with this idea back in the summer of 2013. And although podcasting had been around, it really wasn't until 2014 when you had the true crime podcast Serial debuted. And that's what I think really put podcasting on the map.
Yeah, so we started, our first event was September 30th, 2014, and we actually launched as National Podcast Day. And the origin story behind International Podcast Day is that Steve, my father and the other co-founder of International Podcast Day, was driving, and he was listening to the radio, and he heard a commercial for something like National Senior Citizens Day, something like that. And he just had this thought. He's like, why don't podcasters and the podcast industry have their own day to celebrate? And right then the idea was born. And so as I mentioned, September 2014, which actually marked the 10-year anniversary of the first podcast, because as we know, September 2004 is when Adam Curry originally released the very first podcast. So it was sort of a 10-year celebration. And we just did a quick little 6-hour live broadcast on that day, just US only. And then immediately the day after, no joke, we rebranded to International Podcast Day and really looked forward to celebrating internationally. And that's sort of how International Podcast Day started in 2014.
So this is year number 7. There has been a podcasting boom over that time. Podcast listening has grown by over a third in just the past 2 years. What has stood out to you the most about the growth in the medium?
It's pretty incredible when you look at sort of the incremental and consistent growth of the podcast industry. You did talk about a big major spike in 2014. We've also seen major spikes in 2012 and 2016. And I think that is all ramped up to some of the latest data from Apple Podcasts, where there's 1.5 million podcasts, valid podcasts now in Apple Podcast. And there's almost like 35 million episodes that are available for consumers to get. And I think over this time is you've seen big shifts in different genres, right? You saw a big push with entertainment and movies. And then, as you mentioned, you saw a big climb and incremental push for true crime. And then you saw health and wellness. And then you saw political podcast. And then you saw comedic podcast. And I think one of the most interesting things to watch is not just here domestically, but internationally, how those different markets have adjusted and sort of ebbed and flow with the industry and sort of the times as you go along with it. And so I think it's been an incredible ride and rise of podcasting. I mean, we can go into some more specifics, but I think it's really cool to look internationally and notice like how Brazil has just taken off in podcasting. India, for example, has an incredible podcasting community, and there is a massive desire from the audience out there and the communities and customers there to just consume new media. And I think that's pretty incredible just to look at the total international landscape and really see how people have been adjusting to this on-demand, really flexible sort of listening style to media.
You mentioned the amount of podcasts, and I haven't come across many people, but I have come across a couple, and they say there are too many podcasts. I'm not sure if you've come across any of those people, but what would you say to someone that says there's too many out there?
Yeah, there is a lot, and I will never say there's too many podcasts. Just like I'll never say there's too many live sporting events that you can go to. Like there's just so many things out there. Everybody has a voice. Everybody, if you can get together with some friends, if you have a great story to tell, if you have some unique dialogue or some story that you want to share with everybody, I don't think there's too many. I think you're going to have obviously the good production versus the medium production to the not so great production. I would encourage anybody that's out there to do their best to produce the best possible show. That's not going to be possible just with resources and time and money, and I understand that. But yeah, I will never say there's too many podcasts. I think we've just sort of we're at the base of the iceberg here, and we're just continuing to climb this mountain. And as long as you have a voice, as long as people are willing to sit back, listen, and download your show, whether you're getting 10,000 downloads or 200 downloads, it doesn't matter. If you want to share your story, be creative, be innovative, and also have fun with it.
And people are not complaining. I don't think about, there's too many books being published every year, or there's too many streaming services and all its original content. I don't hear any people complaining about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do like to make those parallels. It's, there's a handful of great TV shows, and there's a handful, as you mentioned, plenty of great books and audiobooks. Again, you don't hear that. It's like, oh, too many of these books are being turned to audiobooks. And, it just, I wonder if it's a fad that most people think is going to die off, or they're just tired of hearing somebody say, hey, listen to my podcast, or have you heard this? But I think regardless of anything that goes on there, there's a demand for it. As long as there's a demand, there's always going to be someone behind the scenes producing some type of show, some type of audio format that's going to be consumed by somebody.
Is there anything you don't like about the industry? Any off-putting trends that you see?
I guess one of the big off-putting trends is when new podcasters that come in try to emulate or mirror their favorite show. And what I mean by that is they try to essentially regurgitate what's already being done, right? If you want to do an interview-based podcast, say in the business industry or in the technology industry or the wellness industry or science industry, you have to be unique. You have to be different, because what you see is the same guest answering the same questions across multiple podcasts. And I don't think that it does for the listener of that podcast per se. It's going to be helpful. But I think being creative with how you approach your show, if you want to have an interview show, great. Come up with a little niche, come up with something different and unique about you and your guest. Make it very regional, make it very specific about within the health industry or the science industry or a particular study of those fields. And so I think that's one of the things that kind of grinds me a little bit, is sometimes you just see sort of this mirrored image of all these shows, and there's plenty of ways to diversify. There's plenty of ways to change the format of your show. And I think that's the only thing that sort of gets to me time after time.
We mentioned the podcast boom over the last several years. Have you noticed, or do you worry about the pandemic bringing that boom to a halt? Because obviously people have had to change their work and commuting patterns. So clearly that's going to impact how people consume the product and how much of it that they consume. And if so, how can the industry adapt to that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting sort of dynamic to think about, how podcast consumption has been affected by the pandemic, whereas podcast production has definitely ramped up. I mean, I think in April 17th of this year, we finally eclipsed the 1 million valid podcasts in the App Store or in the Apple Podcast. And with over a 5-month period now, it's almost 1.5 million. So podcast production is up. But I know personally, when I was sent home for 3 months to work, my listening just dipped significantly, because I wasn't at my office. I didn't have my ride to work. I wasn't able to go on my morning and afternoon walks, and so I was constantly in a sort of a sense of interruption at the house. Right, the animals coming in, people coming to the house. I just want to get up and take a break. And so I think if anything, the pandemic had a little bit of a hit on how people consume, but I think that's on the rebound, where I think people are starting to adapt on how to listen to. They're starting to using their smart speakers at their home to start playing podcasts. People are now, airplaying from their phones through YouTube to have their podcasts, because a lot of podcasters doing that. So I don't have any hesitation that the podcast industry is going to slow down because of the pandemic. I think people are just going to have to adjust their behaviors around how they listen and consume the media. I think that's going to be the big tell.
Yeah, because one area where it has not slowed down, which I want you to talk to me about, this is the ad revenue. I read an article from Forbes just a couple months ago back in July, and it said that despite the pandemic, ad revenue is still expected to increase by almost 15% in 2020. So how does that fit in this space? Because obviously you want to see growth in ad revenue, but some worry that it will hurt what makes podcasting special. They don't want it to go the way of online video.
Yeah, that's a good point to even talk about. And I don't think advertising revenue it's talked about a lot in the space, but not at the largest scale possible, because there are a lot of independent podcasters just want to go out there and produce their shows and do Patreon and find other mechanisms like memberships and stuff. But it's a very important message to take. I know that when the pandemic hit, a lot of advertisers started pulling funds from podcasters because they were starting to see a dip in downloads. Right? There's a certain threshold that these advertisers wanted, whether it was 200,000 downloads, 50,000, 2,000, whatever it was. And then as people shifted again their behaviors and listening, you saw that dollar start to dip. But I think there is so much investment that can be had. I know that there's different podcast hosting companies that are starting to connect with advertisers in the space. The one thing that I love most about the industry itself is it's super creative. It will always find a way to grow itself, to find ways of interjecting cash, interjecting advertising dollars. And that's definitely a needed thing. For a long time, the podcasting industry was very barren when it came to advertising. And I think this has legitimized the media to a large degree. You do have those naysayers that saying, okay, now it's become so conglomerate-like, that it's sort of losing its flavor. But I guess it depends on which side of the coin you consume from. So I think advertising dollars, as you mentioned from that Forbes magazine, will continue to increase. I don't remember the exact dollar amount, but it's gonna continue to be in the billions. Absolutely.
What is the future of podcasting, do you think? Is there something on the horizon that excites you? What would you like to see from the medium going forward? You had mentioned the smart speakers that has led to shorter podcast episodes. That has become something. Would you like to see better analytics? Where are we headed in podcasting?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things in touching on the analytics is having all these podcast hosting companies have validated download numbers. There's a lot of ways within the industry to fudge those numbers and manipulate those numbers. And I know different podcast hosting companies are becoming certified in IAB's new methodology. And I think that's very important to, again, legitimize the industry, to make sure that podcasters are knowing exactly how many downloads, therefore they can get ad dollars on that. I think that's very important. I think one of the big things I see in podcasting coming up, and we see a lot of people doing it now, but not as much. The whole daily podcast release is starting to grow a lot more in popularity. And these, as you mentioned, more short, consumer friendly, 5-10 minutes at a time. And I think that's a really good play to try and drive some attention away from, say, like the news media or the television, where you can get your news updates, soon, or you can kind of kick off your day with some updates. And so, I'm very excited about the industry. I think in general, looking at internationally, I'm really excited to see a lot that's going on in the Spanish speaking parts, where like Latin America and Central America, they're just booming right now. And I think that's a very untapped market at this point. And so I love to see that growth there. I think that's could be a huge potential spike for the industry to look at.
Once again, International Podcast Day is September 30th. Just give us, Dave, an overview of what the day will look like. What will the celebration consist of?
Yeah, so our celebration, you can find all the information over at internationalpodcastday.com. We are going to be streaming 24 live hours of broadcasting, and part of that is our mission at International Podcast Day is to feature and highlight podcasters from around the world. So this year alone, we're celebrating and featuring 60 plus podcasters from 26 different countries. You can head over to internationalpodcastday.com/speakers to see the entire rundown of all the countries and nations represented. And it's going to be a wide variety of topics. There's going to be ones that are focused on the podcasting industry. There's going to be some resources for podcasters, but also for the general audio enthusiast that's within the media space. There's going to be a lot of information there. You really get to see the gamut from New Zealand to Malaysia to Kenya to Egypt to Colombia to Argentina. Again, we have 26 countries represented, which is pretty incredible. So yeah, we live stream and we just try and amplify the voices throughout the international markets that usually don't get an opportunity to present or contribute in some way. And one other thing is there's a lot of different independent meetups and social gatherings going on. And so we definitely encourage everybody to celebrate International Podcast Day in any form and fashion they want. If you want to schedule a virtual meetup, if you want to do giveaways on your podcast, there's a whole laundry list of things you can do over at our website.
Dave Lee, co-founder of International Podcast Day. Again, check them out online at internationalpodcastday.com. International Podcast Day on Instagram, on Twitter at INTL Podcast Day. Dave, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it, and best of luck with the event.
Thank you, Anthony. Appreciate the time.